She was 18 and alone in the world. After the papers were signed and the small house that had been her family's was sold to cover debts, she was left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small canvas satchel, and $2 silver. And with that money, she bought a ruined cabin on a forgotten spur of Whisperwind Ridge, a place the townsfolk claimed was cursed by sorrow. But what no one knew, what she was about to discover, was that sealed behind the cold stones of the hearth was a secret that would not just give her a home, but a history. It was a story of craft and kindness, a story that would change her life forever. If you find value in stories of resilience and quiet strength, consider following our channel for more tales of finding home in unexpected places. Elara Vance was born in the autumn of 1872 in the small, hard-working valley town of Coulter's Creek, a place defined by the sharp scent of pine sawdust and the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Her father, Thomas Vance, was a logger, a man whose hands were as broad and calloused as oak bark, yet gentle enough to mend a bird's wing. Her mother, Anya, had come from the old country with a satchel of seeds and a heart full of quiet patience, and she could make a garden bloom on the rockiest patch of soil. Elara grew up in their small two-room house, a home filled with the smell of baking bread, drying herbs, and the linseed oil her father used on his tools. Her childhood was not one of wealth, but of deep, unspoken love, measured in the way her father would bring her a perfectly formed pine cone or the way her mother would braid wildflowers into her hair. The object she treasured most from that time was a simple thing, a small, smooth locket of polished river stone her mother had worn, holding not a picture, but a single, pressed forget-me-not. When Elara was 9, the fever came through the valley like a silent winter wind, taking Anya first, and then Thomas a week later as he sat holding his wife's cold hand. Elara was sent to live with her father's only remaining family, his sister Martha and her husband, Gerald. They were not unkind people, but they were practical to the point of hardness. Their lives were a ledger of expenses and obligations, and an orphan niece was a heavy entry on the debit side. It was in their house that Elara learned the texture of loneliness, but it was also where she met Silas Blackwood. Silas was the town's carpenter and coffin maker, a widower who lived in a small workshop behind the lumber mill. He was a man of few words, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and hands that seemed to understand the secret language of wood. He saw in Elara a stillness and an attention to detail that others missed. One afternoon, seeing her watching him work, he beckoned her over. He didn't speak, but simply handed her a small block of basswood and a well-worn whittling knife. The knife was a beautiful tool, its blade of dark Sheffield steel honed to a razor's edge, its handle of smooth, aged cherry wood worn to fit a hand perfectly. He showed her how to read the grain, how to make the long, clean cuts that peeled away the wood in fragrant curls. He taught her the difference between the tight grain of oak and the soft gyve of pine, the sturdiness of a mortise and tenon joint, the simple elegance of a dovetail. Under his tutelage, she learned to build a three-legged stool that didn't wobble, to fletch an arrow so it flew true, and to carve a small, perfect wren from a scrap of wood. Silas never offered praise, but he would look at her finished work, run a thumb over a smooth joint, and give a single, slow nod. That nod was worth more than any ribbon or compliment. The whittling knife he eventually gave her became her most prized possession, a tangible link to the only person who had ever seen not what she had lost, but what she was capable of building. For 9 years, Elara lived in the quiet corners of her aunt and uncle's home, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. She did her chores without complaint, mended the clothes, tended the chickens, and found solace in the small workshop with Silas. But as she approached her 18th birthday, the whispers in the house grew louder. Gerald's investment in a new sawmill had failed, and Martha's face was a permanent mask of pinched worry. The ledger was unbalanced, and they were looking for ways to lighten their load. The day after her 18th birthday, the cruelty came, just as the Jason profile described. Not with a shout, but with the quiet finality of a closed account book. She found a small, neatly packed canvas satchel on her cot. Inside were her few spare clothes, her mother's locket, and Silas's knife. On the kitchen table was a note in her aunt's precise, emotionless script. "You are of age now, Ilara. It is time for you to make your own way. We cannot provide for you any longer. This is for the best." Beside the note were $2 silver. She did not cry. She did not knock on their closed bedroom door to plead or argue. The transaction was complete. She picked up the satchel, walked out the front door, and did not look back. The air was cold, but it felt clean. She was alone, with $2 to her name and a set of skills nobody in town seemed to value. She was a line item that had just been erased. She walked out of Coulter's Creek as the sun was rising, a pale yellow smear against the gray mountains. The town was just beginning to stir, the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys, but she felt like a ghost moving through a world that was no longer hers. She followed the main road for a mile, the gravel crunching a steady rhythm under her worn leather boots. Then she turned onto a smaller, less traveled track that began to climb into the high country. This was the old logging road that led up to Whisperwind Ridge, a place most people avoided. The journey was a slow, deliberate ascent into solitude. The landscape shifted around her, the neat farms and pastures of the valley giving way to dense stands of blue spruce and ponderosa pine. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. She was a keen observer, a habit taught by Silas, who believed you could learn everything you needed to know by simply paying attention. She noted the way the moss grew thickest on the north side of the trees, a natural compass. She saw the tracks of a deer that had crossed the path not an hour before, and the high, circling flight of a red-tailed hawk riding the updrafts. The physical reality of her journey was stark. The canvas satchel, which had felt so light at first, grew heavy on her shoulder. A blister was forming on her left heel. Hunger was a dull ache in her stomach, an ache she had grown accustomed to over the years. She stopped once by a fast-running creek, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and cupped her hands to drink. She sat on a mossy boulder and took out the whittling knife Silas had given her. She ran her thumb over the smooth cherry wood handle, the familiar weight of it a small comfort in a vast and indifferent wilderness. She wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. What she felt instead was a profound and hollow sense of being untethered, a boat cut loose from its mooring, drifting on an unknown sea. She walked for most of the day, the sun arcing across the sky, its light filtering down through the thick canopy of trees in shifting, dappled patterns. By late afternoon, the path grew steeper and rockier, and she emerged from the dense forest onto the open expanse of Whisperwind Ridge. The wind that gave the place its name was a constant, steady presence, whispering through the tall grasses and stunted, gnarled pines that clung to the rocky soil. And there, set back against a sheer granite cliff face, was the cabin. It was exactly as the town clerk had described it, a small, forgotten shape against the immense backdrop of the mountains, looking more like a part of the landscape than something built by human hands. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the sound of the wind. She stood there for a long time, just looking at it, her new life, her only option, her $2 home. The acquisition of the cabin was a transaction of quiet desperation, both hers and the town's. She had walked into the Coulter's Creek municipal office, a small, dusty room that smelled of old paper and stale tobacco, and stood before the clerk, a man named Mr. Abernathy with a green eyeshade and ink-stained fingers. He looked at her, a young woman with nothing but a satchel and a determined set to her jaw, and listened to her inquiry about abandoned properties. He sighed, pushed his spectacles up his nose, and pulled a large, leather-bound ledger from a shelf. He ran a finger down a list of foreclosures and tax-delinquent lots. "There's not much," he said, his voice flat. "A few worthless plots of alkali flat downriver. And there's the old row place up on Whisperwind Ridge." He looked at her over his glasses. "You don't want that one, girl. Been empty for 20 years. Roof's half gone, and folks say it's an unlucky spot. Anson Rowe built it, lived there with his wife. She died in childbirth, and he just wasted away up there. Found him in his chair one spring." He paused. "The town's owned it ever since. No one's ever been willing to pay the back taxes." He named a sum that was impossibly high. Ilara met his gaze. "I have $2, she said, her voice steady. Mr. Abernathy stared at her for a long moment. He saw not a beggar, but someone making a final, pragmatic offer. He looked at the ledger, at the long-overdue account of the Rowe property, an annoyance he had to deal with every year. He dipped his pen in the inkwell, scratched out the old numbers, and wrote, "Paid in full $2. He sanded the ink, tore out the deed, and pushed it across the counter. "It's yours," he said, without looking up. "The luck of it, good or bad, is your own business now." And so she stood before it, the deed in her pocket, the sole owner of this monument to sorrow and neglect. The cabin was small, no more than 16 feet by 20 feet, built of hand-hewn hemlock logs, now weathered to a silvery gray. The chinking between the logs, a mixture of mud and moss, had crumbled away in many places, leaving dark gaps that stared like empty eyes. The roof, made of cedar shakes, sagged in the middle, a clear sign of a broken ridgepole. A stone chimney, beautifully constructed from native granite, stood solid and true on the north wall, but a family of swallows had built their nest at its top. The single window on the front was missing most of its glass, the empty panes covered with a tattered piece of burlap. A low porch ran the width of the front, its floorboards rotted through in several spots. Yet, beneath the decay, Ilara saw what Silas had taught her to see: good bones. The foundation stones were massive and perfectly set. The hemlock logs, though weathered, were sound and free of rot. The joinery at the corners was a masterpiece of saddle notching, each log fitting into the next with a craftsman's precision. This was not a shack thrown together in a hurry. It was a home built with skill and love. She pushed open the heavy plank door, its iron hinges groaning in protest. The inside was a single room, filled with the smell of dust, damp, and the faint, lingering scent of a long-dead fire. A thick layer of dust and leaves covered everything. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, one chair overturned. A rope bed frame was pushed against one wall, its mattress ticking long since rotted away. But it was the hearth that drew her eye. It was made of massive, flat slabs of granite, fitted together so perfectly that you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. It was the work of a master stonemason, the heart of the home, cold now for 2 decades, waiting. For the first few weeks, Ilara's life was a cycle of pure survival and relentless labor. She slept on a bed of pine boughs on the floor, wrapped in a thin blanket she had in her satchel. Her first priority was making the cabin weathertight. Using Silas's knife and a small axe she found rusted but salvageable in a corner, she fashioned a crude mallet and wedges from oak branches. She spent days in the woods, felling a dead, standing cedar and painstakingly splitting it into new shakes for the roof. It was brutal, exhausting work, but with each swing of the mallet, she felt a flicker of ownership, of purpose. She patched the holes in the roof, one shake at a time, her hands raw and blistered. Next, she tackled the chinking. She mixed clay from the nearby creek bed with dry grass and moss, forcing the thick daub into the gaps between the logs with her bare hands, sealing the cabin against the constant mountain wind. The work was slow, but with each sealed gap, the single room grew less drafty, more a sanctuary than a ruin. The discovery came on a cold, rainy afternoon in her third week at the cabin. The fire she kept burning in the magnificent stone hearth was the cabin's only source of warmth, but she noticed the hearthstone directly in front of the firebox was slightly loose, rocking almost imperceptibly when she stepped on it. It was a flaw, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise masterful stonework, and it bothered her craftsman's eye. She decided to reset it. Using a sturdy branch as a lever, she worked to pry the massive slab of granite from its bed of sand. It was heavier than she imagined, and she had to put her entire body into it, her muscles straining. With a final groaning scrape, the stone lifted. Beneath it was not just sand, but a small hollowed-out space lined with oilcloth, and inside that space was a small tin box. Her heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm of labor for weeks, gave a sudden, sharp thump. With trembling fingers, she lifted the box out. It wasn't locked. She opened the lid. The contents were simple, but they made her gasp. There were 20 gold double eagle coins, their surfaces gleaming in the dim light. Stacked neatly beside them was a sheaf of crisp banknotes from a bank that had ceased to exist 15 years ago. And on top of it all was a letter, folded and sealed with wax, and a single, perfectly smooth, egg-shaped river stone of a deep green color. She sat on the dirt floor, the rain drumming on her newly repaired roof, and carefully broke the wax seal. The letter was written in a strong, clear hand. It read, October 12th, 1853. My name is Anson Rowe. I am a stonemason by trade, and I built this cabin with my own hands for my wife, Elspeth. We came to this ridge to build a life away from the noise of the world. We had 2 good years here, the happiest of my life. She is gone now. The baby, a girl we would have named Lily, went with her. I have buried them on the hill overlooking the creek, where the wild columbines grow. The world has lost its color for me. This box contains all our savings, the money we had set aside to buy a small flock of sheep and to build a proper cradle. I have no use for it now. I do not know how much longer I will remain. The winter is coming, both outside and in my heart, so I am leaving this here. To whoever finds this, I hope this money finds you when you are in need. I hope it helps you build something new, something that lasts. Life is a fragile thing, but a well-built wall can stand for 100 years. Build a good life for yourself. Be kind. That is all the payment I ask. The stone was Elspeth's favorite. She said it felt like holding a piece of the river's heart. Perhaps you will find a place for it. Ilara read the letter 3 times, her fingers tracing Anson's strong, steady script. The coins were a fortune, the means to survive. But the letter was a gift of a different kind. It was a connection, a story. Anson Rowe was no longer just a name on a deed. He was a man who had loved and lost, and who, in his deepest grief, had thought of a stranger. She picked up the smooth green stone. It was cool and solid in her palm. In that moment, in the dusty, half-repaired cabin, she was not alone. She was the inheritor of a quiet legacy, a recipient of a kindness sent across 20 years of silence. She wept then, for the first time since leaving her aunt's house, not for herself, but for Anson and Elspeth, and for the simple, heartbreaking beauty of their story. The money changed everything, but not in the way one might expect. Ilara did not abandon the cabin or her work. Instead, the discovery settled a deep calm within her. Anson Rowe's legacy was not just wealth, it was a charge to build, and she intended to honor it. The gold gave her the means to do the work properly. The next morning, She walked the long way back down to Coulter's Creek, her steps lighter than they had been on her journey up. She went first to the general store, a place she had only ever looked at through the window. She bought sacks of flour, beans, and salt, a new cast-iron skillet, a warm wool blanket, and most importantly, a small crate of glass panes for the window. She then went to the blacksmith's shop, where she commissioned a new axe head and a set of pry bars. The blacksmith, a burly man named Jebediah Stone, looked at the pristine gold coin she offered, then at her calloused hands, and simply nodded, promising to have the tools ready by week's end. With proper tools and supplies, the rebuilding began in earnest. The work was no less difficult, but it was now imbued with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. She was not just repairing a ruin, she was resurrecting a home. She spent a week carefully reglazing the window, using a putty she made herself from linseed oil and chalk. The first time the morning sun streamed through the clear glass, filling the small room with light, it felt like a miracle. She used the pry bars to level the sagging porch, replacing the rotted planks with new ones cut from a fallen pine. She meticulously re-chinked every log, inside and out, until the cabin was a fortress against the wind. She even climbed the roof and cleared the swallow's nest from the chimney, then spent a day sweeping it clean. The first fire she lit in the clean chimney drew perfectly, sending a plume of white smoke straight up into the crisp mountain air. It was during this time that the community began to find her, not through charity, but through the shared language of work. Jebediah Stone, the blacksmith, rode up one afternoon to deliver her tools himself, curious about the girl on the ridge. He saw the new shakes on the roof, the clean lines of the porch, and the solid chinking. He looked at her work, much as Silas once had, and gave a slow, approving nod. "You do good work," he said. Before he left, he noticed her struggling to sharpen her old axe. He took it from her, and with a few deft strokes of a file he carried, he put an edge on it that could shave a hair. He asked for nothing in return. A week later, a woman named Mrs. Gable, a widow who lived on a small farm at the base of the ridge, appeared at her door. She carried a basket containing a loaf of fresh sourdough bread, a crock of butter, and a small jar of sourdough starter. "A house isn't a home without the smell of bread baking," she said simply. She saw the neat stacks of firewood Alara had cut and the small, flourishing herb garden Alara had planted near the door, using seeds she'd bought in town. Mrs. Gable began making the climb once a week, not out of pity, but out of a growing respect. One afternoon, a young trapper named Finn, who worked the high country, passed by while Alara was trying to hoist a new mantelpiece, a single massive piece of fire-cured oak above the hearth. He stopped, and without a word, took the other end and helped her muscle it into place. When it was set, she offered him a cup of hot chicory coffee, and they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the valley. He pointed out the best places to find chanterelle mushrooms after a rain, and she showed him a better way to tie a snare knot. Community was not built with words, but with shared effort and quiet, mutual respect. Slowly, imperceptibly, the cabin on Whisperwind Ridge transformed from a place of sorrow into a place of life. The curse was broken, not by any magic, but by the steady application of skill and persistence. Alara became a part of the landscape, a known quantity. People in Coulter's Creek no longer spoke of the cursed Row place, but of Alara's cabin on the ridge. Her home became a landmark, a single point of warm, golden light visible from the valley floor after dusk, a sign that the lonely mountain was no longer empty. Her life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons. In the spring, she planted a larger garden, the soil rich and black beneath the pines. In the summer, she picked wild berries and fished for trout in the creek. In the autumn, she chopped and stacked wood, preparing for the long winter. The winters were harsh and isolating, with snow piling deep against her door, but she was never lonely. The cabin was warm and snug, the fire in Anson Rowe's hearth crackling cheerfully. She spent the long winter evenings by the firelight, carving. Using the skills Silas had taught her, she carved intricate figures from scraps of wood. Soaring hawks, patient deer, sleeping foxes. When spring came again, she would take a collection of her carvings down to the general store in town. The store owner, surprised by their quality and lifelike detail, offered to sell them for her. They sold quickly. The small income was more than enough for the few supplies she needed. She became known for her craft. People would come to her not with charity, but with purpose. Jebediah Stone traded a set of custom-made carving tools for a detailed carving of his prize-winning boar. Mrs. Gable traded a dozen laying hens for a set of carved songbirds to decorate her mantel. Finn brought her prime beaver pelts in exchange for a sturdy new set of snowshoes she wove from ash and rawhide. She was no longer an outsider, a charity case, or a forgotten orphan. She was a craftswoman, a part of the small, interwoven economy of the valley. She had a place. Her home, once a symbol of isolation, had become the center of her world, a quiet hub of skill and trade. She had, in the truest sense of the word, built a life for herself, nail by nail, log by log, cut by careful cut. One evening, in the heart of her second winter on the ridge, Ilara sat in a chair she had built herself, its back woven from strips of hickory bark. The fire in the hearth cast a warm, dancing light across the room, illuminating the smooth, planed floorboards and the neatly organized shelves. The air was filled with the scent of pine and stew and drying herbs. The wind howled outside, a familiar, lonely sound, but inside, all was calm and warm. Her gaze fell upon the new oak mantelpiece above the hearth. On one end sat the whittling knife Silas had given her, its cherry wood handle gleaming. On the other end sat Anson Rowe's smooth green riverstone. Two objects from two men she had never truly known in the same way the world demands, yet who had shaped her life more profoundly than anyone. Silas had given her the skill, the knowledge of how to shape the world with her own two hands. He had taught her that value was not something you were given, but something you created through patient, honest work. Anson, a stranger connected to her only by a shared piece of land and a profound act of hope, had given her the means. He had left a gift not of charity, but of faith. Faith that someone would come after him who needed a new beginning. Someone who would see the good bones beneath the ruin. She thought of her aunt and uncle, not with bitterness, but with a distant, quiet understanding. Theirs was a world of ledgers and bottom lines, a world where a person could be a liability. Their cold, practical cruelty had been the catalyst, the harsh push that had sent her out into the world with nothing. And in having nothing, she had been forced to find everything. She had found a home not by buying one ready-made, but by taking a forgotten, broken thing and pouring her own strength and spirit into it. She had found a community not by asking for help, but by proving her competence. She had found a family not of blood, but of shared respect and quiet kindness. A family that included a long-dead stonemason and a taciturn carpenter. Ilara Vance was 19 years old, and she was home. She had $2 to her name when she arrived on this mountain, and she spent it on a pile of rotting logs and a story of sorrow. It was the best $2 she had ever spent. The story of Ilara Vance is a reminder that what others discard can sometimes hold the greatest value, and that a home is not just a structure, but a testament to the work and heart we pour into it. If her journey resonated with you, please consider sharing this story with someone who appreciates tales of quiet strength and resilience. We all have abandoned cabins in our lives, projects, relationships, or parts of ourselves we've neglected. What is one forgotten thing in your life that, with a little care and attention, you could rebuild into something